So, no, I wouldn't say I have a passion for HR.
Welcome back to Human Resources for the People. It's a human capital revolution. Today I'm going to be talking about a layoff that happened at the LA Times last week, and they fired 115 journalists in an HR Zoom webinar. And we're going to talk about it. Let's go take you back a week or so to January 19th. And on January 19th, the Los Angeles Times Guild, which is the union there at the Los Angeles Times, staged a one-day walkout in multiple cities because they knew that this layoff was coming. They held a rally at near City Hall in Los Angeles, and the staffers joined in from across the United States and I believe the world, if I'm not mistaken. This was the first newsroom union work stoppage for the Times since 1881, and this union represents about 400 editorial employees that work there. And what this ultimately stems from is the owner's massive losses. Since he bought the company a few years ago, bought the newspaper a few years ago, he's lost at least 100 million, and some people are saying that he's losing about 30 to 40 million a year. There were third round of cuts since June, so I mean they have been cutting and cutting and cutting. What's interesting is that the Los Angeles Guild actually asked the union to allow for senior protections to be removed from the union contract in order to give them more choice into who to lay off. And that's going to actually, we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a moment because that put the union in a bit of a predicament. The Los Angeles Times Guild took to Twitter to respond to the mass layoffs in a letter, in a two-page letter that you can see here. They start off by saying that the contract that the Los Angeles Times lawyers negotiated with the guild, management can offer buyouts on any day at any time. And they said, well, that's a more humane way to make cuts. And while that's true, ultimately, this guild has negotiated these terms. If they wanted terms that were more clear, that demanded buyouts at any time or gave specific payouts in order to make cuts, that should have been bargained and negotiated for. But instead, it was open or not open to interpretation, but open to operation. The Los Angeles Times could choose how they wanted to execute this, and they executed it via a webinar, which the Los Angeles Times Guild said, well, that's not humane at all, and I would tend to agree. But I'm not sure. For example, many of these people who were terminated were across the United States and I believe across the world. And as a result, I'm not sure if there's a much better way, right, to do a mass termination all at once. Then the guild, says, well, they didn't even allow a question. I'm not sure, speaking as someone who, might have to navigate something like this, I'm not sure that a question at a time like this would be a productive way. Understood that people will want information about specific terms of what's going to happen going forward, but ultimately questions at that point, I can imagine why there was that choice not to allow for questions because generally speaking, questions like that are not going to be productive, and I think anyone can expect that. Now, the Los Angeles Guild also seemed to accuse the company, who is led by Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, who is an Asian South African American, of racism. And it's not quite as explicit, I would say. I mean, let's be clear here. But it says that the company has reneged on its promises to diversify its ranks since young journalists of color have been disproportionately affected. And so it talks about how it hurt these specific groups. Now, I will say that is going to be the nature of seniority, since the younger population in America is significantly more diverse than the older population. Then and the union was not willing to remove its seniority requirement, which is by its contract. Ultimately, that's who is going to be affected. It's a nature of contracts, throughout the Western world, and specifically union contracts, that when seniority is a process or is chosen for layoffs, this is likely to happen. That doesn't mean that seniority is still a very important portion to this, but it has to be a reality that people recognize. The one thing that I found a little bit interesting is that the Los Angeles Guild stated that the management wanted the guild to agree to extreme layoff terms. It didn't even want to put on the record, saying that they were asking journalists to sign off on it without telling them what was in the deal. It sounds like that these were the buyouts that the guild was looking for, but for whatever reason, the Los Angeles Times weren't interested in going forward with it. And I would like to know more about what that process. I'm sure we'll never hear specifically what happened there, but there is a process set out in the contract between the guild and the Los Angeles Times. And ultimately, it sounds like the contract was followed. The guild doesn't make the arguments. The guild doesn't seem to be filing an unfair labor practice charge or anything of that nature. Obviously the layoffs are regrettable, but I don't understand this response. It sounds like the Times is simply following the contract, and the guild is accusing them or arguing with them with respect to that. Let me know what you think about the guild's discussion here down below in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video. Bye, guys.